The battlefield stretched like a desolate canvas, painted in shades of scorched earth and jagged debris. Smoke rose in toxic plumes, choking the sky and casting an eerie twilight over the broken plains of Delzer. The sound of distant explosions rumbled through the air, a grim reminder of humanity's failing struggle against the alien Clythors. Captain Darian Hudson crouched behind a shattered supply truck, his weathered face streaked with grime and sweat. His brown eyes scanned the horizon, sharp and calculating, while his hand hovered near the hilt of his plasma saber. The battle had been raging for hours, and his platoon was reduced to half its original strength. Morale was thin, hope thinner. "We can't hold this position much longer, Captain," said Sergeant Blake Torrance, his voice gravelly from days without proper rest. The younger man's expression mirrored the desperation of their situation. His rifle dangled loosely in his hands, more from exhaustion than neglect. Hudson glanced at Torrance and then at the rest of his unit huddled behind makeshift barricades. These soldiers weren't just tired. They were broken. "We'll hold," Hudson said firmly, though the conviction in his voice was more for their benefit than his own. Torrance arched a brow, his skepticism evident. "With all due respect, sir, the Clythors don't know the meaning of retreat. They'll keep coming until there's nothing left of us to fight back." Hudson didn't argue. The Clythors, a hive-mind species with carapace-like armor and deadly precision, were unlike anything humanity had faced before. Their relentless assaults left no room for error, their bioweapons turning even the smallest wound into a death sentence. A sharp crackle burst from Hudson's communicator. "Captain Hudson, come in." The voice was distorted but familiar. Lieutenant Marcus Henshaw, their tech specialist stationed at the rear command post. Hudson pressed a button on his wrist console. "I'm here. Status: bad, sir. Reinforcements aren't coming. Fleet Command says they've been cut off near Eridani. We're on our own." The words hit like a physical blow. Hudson exhaled slowly, steadying himself before replying. "Understood. We'll hold as long as we can." He cut the line before anyone could hear the crack in his voice. Torrance's face darkened. "Reinforcements?" "None," Hudson replied curtly. A low rumble in the distance interrupted their exchange. It wasn't the usual drone of Clythor assault pods. This was deeper, more deliberate. The soldiers exchanged wary glances, weapons raised. "Movement," one of the scouts called out, pointing toward the eastern ridge. Hudson adjusted his visor, zooming in on the distant source of the sound. A sleek, black dropship descended from the ash-filled sky, its hull gleaming like an onyx blade. It landed with practiced precision, sending clouds of dust billowing outward. "What now?" Torrance muttered, gripping his rifle tighter. The dropship's ramp lowered, and a lone figure emerged. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and clad in tactical armor that looked more advanced than anything Hudson had seen in years. A hood shadowed his face, but his confident stride spoke volumes. Behind him, shapes emerged, for massive wolves, each the size of a small vehicle. The wolves moved with a predator's grace, their fur gleaming with metallic accents. One, a massive black beast with glowing crimson eyes, stepped forward, surveying the battlefield with an almost human intelligence. The figure stopped a few paces from Hudson's barricade and pulled back his hood, revealing a rugged, bearded face marked by faint scars. His piercing gray eyes locked onto Hudson. "Who the hell are you?" Torrance asked, his voice tinged with equal parts awe and suspicion. "Rogan Wolf," the man said, his voice calm and steady. He gestured to the wolves. "And these are my partners." Hudson rose from his cover, his saber still in hand. "You're not with the fleet. Where did you come from?" Rogan smirked faintly. "Let's just say I don't answer to fleet command. I'm here because you need me. And why should I trust you?" Hudson shot back, his tone sharp. Before Rogan could reply, a high-pitched screech filled the air. Clythor drones, sleek and insect-like, swarmed over the ridge, their weapons glinting ominously in the dim light. "No time for introductions," Rogan said, unslinging a modified rifle from his back. He whistled sharply, and the wolves sprang into action. The black wolf, the one Rogan had called Fenrir, charged ahead, its cybernetic limbs propelling it with unnatural speed. It leaped onto the nearest drone, its jaws crunching through the alien alloy as if it were paper. The others followed suit, attacking with a precision that stunned Hudson's unit into momentary inaction. Focus fires, Hudson barked, snapping his men back to the present. The wolves tore through the drones with brutal efficiency, their attacks perfectly timed to exploit the weaknesses in the Clythor's formations. Fenrir led the pack, while a sleek, silver wolf darted through the chaos, disabling drones with surgical strikes. A third wolf, bulkier than the others, bulldozed through the enemy lines, shrugging off plasma fire. Torrance muttered a curse under his breath. "What the hell are those things?" "Deadly," Rogan replied, firing a precise shot that downed a drone aiming for Hudson. "But they'll get the job done." The skirmish was over in minutes. Where Clythor drones had once swarmed, now only charred remains and shattered armor lay scattered across the ground. Hudson lowered his weapon, his heart still racing. He turned to Rogan, who stood calmly amidst the carnage, the wolves at his side. "Start talking," Hudson demanded. Rogan met his gaze, unflinching. "I'm here to help you in this war. And trust me, Captain, you're going to need us." Hudson hesitated, studying the man and his unusual allies. For the first time in weeks, a spark of hope flickered in his chest. "Then let's get to work," he said. The wolves growled softly, their glowing eyes reflecting the dim light of the dying battlefield. Hudson knew the war was far from over, but with Rogan Wolf and his deadly wolves by their side, humanity's chances of survival might have just shifted. The makeshift command post was little more than a reinforced storage container tucked into a shallow ravine. It offered scant protection from the Clythor's aerial scans, but was enough to house Captain Hudson's dwindling platoon. Inside, dim lighting cast flickering shadows over scarred maps and scattered ammunition crates. The air was thick with tension, but it carried a new energy, a cautious optimism, since the arrival of Rogan Wolf and his lethal companions. Rogan leaned against a metal crate, arms crossed, his gray eyes calm but observant. His wolves flanked him, their metallic forms blending into the dim surroundings. Fenrir, the black alpha wolf, sat at his feet like a sentinel, its crimson eyes glowing faintly. Hudson stood across from him, his helmet off, revealing a face lined with equal parts exhaustion and curiosity. "You said you don't answer to fleet command, so who sent you?" "No one," Rogan replied, his voice steady. "I came because someone has to fight these bastards the way they need to be fought. And you think that's with them?" Sergeant Torrance gestured toward the wolves, his tone skeptical. Rogan's gaze shifted to Torrance, sharp as a blade. "They're not just wolves. They're the result of years of research, my research, designed specifically to counter threats like the Clythors. Enhanced intelligence, cybernetic augmentations, adaptive combat algorithms. They're the best shot you've got." Hudson raised a brow. "Research? You're a scientist." Rogan corrected. "Biotechnology, military applications. After what happened on New Epsilon, I figured it was better to take the fight to the enemy than sit in a lab waiting for humanity to die off." The mention of New Epsilon silenced the room. Everyone knew the story, an entire colony wiped out in a matter of hours by the Clythors. Hudson studied Rogan's face, noting the shadow that passed over it. "What happened there?" Hudson asked. Rogan hesitated, his jaw tightening. "I'll tell you this much. We underestimated them. We can't afford to make that mistake again." Fenrir let out a low growl, drawing the soldiers' attention. Rogan placed a hand on the wolf's head, his expression softening for a moment. "They're more than weapons. They're partners. Family." Torrance snorted. "Family? They're machines. They're alive," Rogan snapped, his voice cutting through the room. "More alive than half the people who've given up this fight." Hudson raised a hand to diffuse the brewing tension. All right, let's focus. You said these wolves were designed to counter the Clythors. How exactly? Rogan nodded and knelt beside Fenrir. Each of them was engineered with specific roles in mind. He gestured to the Black Wolf. Fenrir, the Alpha, tactical leader, brute force, and frontline combat. He pointed to a sleek, silver wolf with glowing blue eyes pacing near the doorway. That's Shadow, stealth and infiltration. Cloaking tech lets her slip behind enemy lines undetected. The third wolf, massive and stocky, stood near a pile of crates. Its gunmetal gray fur bristled as it adjusted its stance. Havoc, Rogan said. Heavy assault, built to take hits and dish out destruction. And the fourth? Hudson asked, noticing a smaller, copper-colored wolf that seemed to linger in the shadows, observing silently. Lynx, Rogan replied. Recon and surveillance. She's the eyes and ears of the pack, gathering intel faster than any drone could. The soldiers exchanged glances, clearly impressed but unwilling to show it outright. Torrance, however, couldn't resist another jab. Sounds like a lot of fancy tech. What happens if they break down? Or turn on us? Rogan met his gaze with an unwavering intensity. They won't. They're loyal. And they don't break. Because I don't let them. Before Torrance could respond, a sharp bark from Fenrir interrupted him. The Black Wolf turned toward the entrance, its ears pricking up. Shadow crouched low, growling softly. What is it? Hudson asked, already reaching for his weapon. Rogan held up a hand. Trouble. He glanced at Hudson. You're about to see what they can do. The howl of Clythor drones echoed through the ravine, growing louder with each passing second. Hudson's soldiers scrambled to defensive positions, their weapons trained on the narrow approach to the command post. Position your men at the choke points, Rogan said calmly, his tone that of someone who'd seen this scenario 100 times. The wolves and I will handle the rest. Hudson hesitated, then nodded. You heard him. Defensive positions. The Clythors arrived in force, their insectoid frames glinting under the pale light. They swarmed the ravine, their sharp limbs clattering against the rocks as they advanced. Go, Rogan commanded. The wolves moved as one. Fenrir charged headlong into the fray, smashing into the first wave of drones with terrifying force. Its jaws clamped down on a Clythor's head, tearing it free in a spray of alien ichor. Havoc followed, plowing through the swarm with brute strength, its reinforced frame shrugging off enemy fire. Shadow disappeared in a shimmer of blue light, her cloaking field activating. Moments later, drones began to drop, their joints severed by precise strikes. Lynx circled the battlefield, her sensors feeding Rogan real-time data through his visor. The soldiers watched in awe as the wolves executed their roles with seamless precision. Torrance muttered under his breath, Damn. They're good. Keep your focus, Sergeant, Hudson barked, though his tone lacked its usual edge. Rogan moved through the chaos like a phantom, his rifle spitting plasma bolts with deadly accuracy. He barked commands to the wolves, each one responding instantly. Havoc, left flank. Shadow, disrupt the rear. The tide began to turn. The Clythors, unaccustomed to such coordinated resistance, faltered. Their formation broke, and the surviving drones retreated into the darkness. When the last drone fell, a heavy silence settled over the ravine. The soldiers slowly emerged from cover, their expressions a mixture of disbelief and relief. Hudson approached Rogan, who stood at the center of the battlefield, Fenrir by his side. The wolf's dark fur was streaked with alien blood, but its crimson eyes burned with undiminished intensity. I'll admit, Hudson said, his voice grudgingly respectful, you've made a believer out of me. Rogan gave a small nod. Good, because this was just a warm-up. The real fight's ahead. As the wolves regrouped around their handler, Hudson found himself staring at them. There was something almost uncanny about their movements, the way they seemed to anticipate each other's actions without a word. We'll talk more in the morning, Hudson said, turning toward the command post. For now, get some rest. You've earned it. Rogan didn't reply, his focus already shifting to the wolves, checking their systems and wounds with practice care. As Hudson walked away, he couldn't shake the feeling that this man and his deadly wolves were far more than they seemed. The War Council was a crude gathering of exhausted soldiers clustered around a flickering holographic display. The map of the battlefield shimmered, unstable, but clear enough to show the daunting truth. The Clythor's forces were closing in from all sides. Captain Hudson stood at the head of the table, his jaw tight, eyes fixed on the growing red markers representing the enemy. Rogan Wolf leaned against the far wall, his arms crossed, the wolves spread out near him like living shadows. The room felt small with them in it, their presence commanding an almost primal respect. "We're boxed in," Lieutenant Marcus Henshaw said, adjusting his glasses and pointing to the screen. "The main Clythor force is concentrated here." He highlighted a massive hive-shaped structure deep behind enemy lines. "That's their command node. Destroying it would sever their hive-mind connection, but—" he hesitated. "But it's suicide," Sergeant Torrance finished, his tone heavy with frustration. "We'd have to fight through 3 divisions just to get close." Hudson nodded grimly. "And if we don't, they'll crush us within hours. We can't hold this position much longer." A long silence fell over the room, broken only by the occasional crackle of static from the hologram. Then Rogan spoke, his voice calm but firm. "We don't hold. We strike." Torrance scoffed. "You didn't hear the lieutenant? That hive is surrounded." "I heard him," Rogan replied evenly. "But the Clythors are predictable. They rely on brute force and numbers. They won't expect a small team to slip through their defenses." He glanced at Hudson. "Your soldiers hold the line here, a diversion to keep the enemy focused. Meanwhile, the wolves and I infiltrate the hive and take it down." Henshaw frowned. "And how exactly do you plan to do that?" Rogan's lips curved into a faint smile. "With precision and chaos." Fenrir growled softly, as if understanding the plan. The sound sent a shiver down Torrance's spine, though he quickly masked it. Hudson considered Rogan's words, his expression unreadable. "You're confident this will work?" Rogan shrugged. "I've done worse with less. But if you've got a better idea, now's the time." Hudson's gaze swept across the room, meeting the uncertain eyes of his men. Finally, he turned back to Rogan. "You've got one chance. We'll hold the line as long as we can, but you'd better succeed. If you don't—" "We will," Rogan said, the quiet certainty in his tone silencing further argument. The night fell quickly, cloaking the battlefield in darkness. Hudson's platoon fortified their position, their movements tense but resolute. Explosions flared in the distance as Clythor artillery pounded the landscape, the noise a grim reminder of the stakes. Rogan and the wolves moved silently through the shadows, their presence ghostly. Fenrir led the way, its crimson eyes cutting through the gloom. Shadow darted ahead, her cloaking field rendering her nearly invisible. Havoc and Lynx followed, their movements purposeful and deliberate. As they neared the enemy perimeter, Rogan activated his visor, scanning for patrols. "Shadow, take point," he whispered. The silver wolf disappeared into the darkness, her live form melting into the terrain. Moments later, the faint crackle of disabled sentry drones came through Rogan's comlink. "Clear," he muttered, signaling the pack forward. The enemy defenses were formidable, rows of turrets and watchtowers manned by insectoid sentries. But the wolves were relentless. Havoc bulldozed through barricades with sheer brute force, while Lynx hacked into enemy systems, feeding false data to confuse their response. Fenrir and Shadow eliminated sentries with precision, leaving no trace of their approach. Rogan stayed close behind, his rifle at the ready. Every movement was calculated, every shot deliberate. The wolves were his partners, but he was their anchor, their strategist. Together, they were unstoppable. As they infiltrated deeper into enemy territory, The hive loomed ahead. It was a grotesque structure of organic and metallic components, pulsating with a sickly green light. The air grew heavier, laced with a chemical tang that burned the throat. "This is it," Rogan said, his voice barely audible. "Fenrir, guard the entrance. Shadow, scout inside. Havoc, Lynx with me." Shadow slipped into the hive, her movements silent as a whisper. Rogan followed with Havoc and Lynx, their combined presence a deadly force. The interior was a maze of corridors, the walls alive with twitching tendrils and shifting panels. As they navigated the hive, the resistance intensified. Clyther elites swarmed from hidden alcoves, their razor-sharp limbs slicing through the air. Havoc charged into the fray, smashing through their ranks with a feral roar. Lynx darted between them, her small frame making her a hard target as she delivered precise strikes to critical systems. Rogan moved with ruthless efficiency, his rifle spitting plasma bolts that found their mark every time. But the deeper they went, the more the hive seemed to resist. The walls shifted, sealing off passages and forcing them to adapt. "Shadow, report," Rogan called through his comlink. "Central chamber ahead." Her voice came through, calm and steady. "Heavy resistance." "Good," Rogan muttered. "That means we're close." They regrouped at the entrance to the central chamber. The hive's core pulsated at its center, a massive, glowing structure guarded by Clyther elites. Their chittering echoed through the space, a sound that sent shivers down even Rogan's spine. "This is where we end it," he said, his voice steady. "Havoc, draw their fire. Shadow, disrupt their rear. Lynx, find me an opening to the core. Fenrir with me." The wolves sprang into action, their movements a blur of violence and precision. Havoc charged headlong into the elites, his sheer mass scattering them like leaves. Shadow struck from the darkness, dismantling their defenses piece by piece. Lynx worked furiously, hacking into the core systems to disable its shielding. Rogan and Fenrir pushed forward, carving a path through the chaos. The core's energy surged, its light growing blinding as it prepared to retaliate. "Now, Lynx!" Rogan shouted. The copper wolf let out a sharp bark, and the core's shield flickered and collapsed. Without hesitation, Rogan placed an explosive charge at its base. "Fall back," he commanded. The wolves obeyed, retreating with practiced efficiency. Rogan was the last to leave, his eyes fixed on the timer, counting down on the charge. As they emerged from the hive, a deafening explosion tore through the structure, sending shockwaves across the battlefield. The hive collapsed in on itself, its pulsating light snuffed out. The remaining Clythors faltered, their movements disorganized and sluggish without the hive-mind connection. Rogan watched the destruction, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Fenrir stood beside him, its glowing eyes scanning the battlefield. "It's done," Rogan said softly. From the distant ridge, Hudson's soldiers cheered as the enemy forces crumbled. Hudson himself lowered his binoculars, a rare smile breaking through his grim demeanor. "You did it," he murmured, his voice filled with equal parts relief and admiration. But Rogan wasn't smiling. His gaze remained on the horizon, where new threats undoubtedly waited. This was a victory, but the war was far from over. The battlefield was eerily silent. What moments ago had been a cacophony of explosions and alien screeches was now a graveyard, littered with the remnants of shattered Clythors and their gutted hive. Smoke curled lazily into the dawn sky, tinged red by the rising sun. Rogan Wolf stood at the edge of the ruins, his shoulders square but his eyes distant. The mission had been a success. The hive destroyed, its connection severed. But the cost of victory was etched into every scarred piece of ground. Fenrir sat at his side, its black fur scorched in patches, its once bright crimson eyes dimmed. The other wolves were scattered nearby, licking wounds and recharging their energy cores in silence. Behind him, Hudson approached with a measured stride, his helmet tucked under his arm. His face was streaked with soot and exhaustion, but there was a glimmer of respect in his eyes. "Hell of a show you put on out there," he said, his voice cutting through the quiet. Rogan didn't turn immediately. When he did, his expression was unreadable. "We did what had to be done." Hudson nodded, glancing at the wolves. "Your team held the line. Without them, we wouldn't have survived." Torrance won't admit it, but even he was impressed. "I'm not here to impress anyone," Rogan replied. His tone was calm, but Hudson caught the edge beneath it. For a moment, they stood in silence, watching the soldiers moving among the debris, pulling their injured comrades to safety. The celebration was muted, every cheer tainted by the memory of those who hadn't made it back. Hudson broke the silence. "We won today, Wolf. That's not something I say often anymore." Rogan's jaw tightened. "Today," he repeated. "But you know as well as I do, this war isn't over. This was a single hive. The Clythors have more." Hudson looked at him, studying the hard lines of the man's face. "You're right," he admitted, "but this was a blow they'll feel. A reminder that we're not done fighting." Before Rogan could respond, a faint whine from Lynx drew his attention. The copper wolf limped toward him, her gait uneven. Rogan knelt, running a hand over her sleek frame, checking for damage. "You did good, girl," he murmured. Hudson watched the interaction, his brow furrowing. "You really care about them, don't you? The wolves. They're not just machines," Rogan said without looking up. "They're more than weapons. They've saved my life more times than I can count. And I've lost enough already." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Hudson didn't press, but he filed the remark away, another piece of the puzzle that was Rogan Wolf. A sharp crackle from the comms interrupted the moment. Henshaw's voice came through, strained but urgent. "Captain, you need to see this." Hudson pressed his earpiece. "Go ahead, Lieutenant. We've intercepted a Clytha transmission. It's not good. They know the hive is down, and they're mobilizing reinforcements. Estimated time to arrival, 4 hours, tops." Hudson swore under his breath. "Understood. Hold position and keep monitoring." Rogan rose, his expression grim. "They'll come harder next time. They'll adapt. Then we'd better move fast," Hudson said. "We'll regroup. Fall back to a defensible position." "No," Rogan interrupted, his tone sharp. "We hit them again." Hudson blinked. "You can't be serious. My men are exhausted, half of them injured. We've just barely survived this. That's why we strike now," Rogan said, stepping closer. "Before they have a chance to consolidate, before they adapt. If we wait, they'll overwhelm us. But if we keep them off balance," he trailed off, letting the implication hang in the air. Hudson shook his head, his frustration mounting. "You think the wolves can handle everything. But my soldiers are human. They have limits." "So do the Clythors," Rogan countered. "We've found theirs. Now we exploit it." Hudson hesitated, torn between the tactical logic and the weight of his men's lives. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "Fine, but this time we do it together. No lone wolf stunts." A faint smile flickered across Rogan's face. "Deal." The final assault was a desperate gamble. Hudson's platoon, battered but determined, advanced alongside Rogan and the wolves. They moved swiftly, targeting key Clytha outposts, dismantling their infrastructure piece by piece. The wolves led the charge, their movements tireless despite their injuries. Fenrir's growls echoed across the battlefield as it tore through the enemy ranks. Havoc's massive frame absorbed the brunt of the Clythors' retaliation, shielding the soldiers as they pushed forward. Shadow and Lynx darted ahead, their precision strikes disabling enemy turrets and cutting off reinforcements. Rogan fought alongside them, his rifle blazing, his commands sharp and decisive. Hudson found himself watching the man as much as the wolves. There was something almost feral in Rogan's determination, as if the war had stripped him down to his rawest instincts. The tide turned faster than anyone anticipated. The Clythors, already weakened by the hive's destruction, struggled to mount an effective defense. By the time the sun reached its zenith, the last of their forces lay broken, their organic frames sparking and twitching in the dirt. Hudson's soldiers let out a ragged cheer, their victory hard-earned but undeniable. The battlefield, though scarred, was theirs. Rogan stood at the center of it all, his wolves gathering around him. Their metal bodies bore fresh damage, but their eyes shone with a fierce, undying light. He placed a hand on Fenrir's head, a silent gesture of gratitude. Hudson approached, his helmet under his arm. "You were right," he said, his voice laced with grudging admiration. Pushing forward was the only choice. Rogan nodded but said nothing. His gaze was fixed on the horizon, where the next battle surely waited. "You ever stop?" Hudson asked, half-joking. Rogan's lips twitched into a faint smile. "Not until they do." For a moment, there was silence. Then Hudson extended his hand. "We'll fight with you, Wolf. Whatever comes next." Rogan clasped it firmly. "Good, because this war is far from over." As the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows over the battlefield, the soldiers began to regroup. Victory today was only a step, a hard-fought step, in a war that had claimed so much. But for the first time in a long while, there was hope. Rogan and his wolves stood as a testament to that hope, relentless, unyielding, and ready for whatever came next.